Employment Allocation of Tips Bill, second reading.
Mr Dean Russell.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I am truly incredibly pleased that we have time today to debate this important issue and this bill. As the Member of Parliament for Watford, we have a thriving hospitality and service sector, and this means many of my constituents and those from surrounding areas work in roles where tips, gratuities and service charges are given to them. For the simplicity of my speech, I will refer to them as tips from now on rather than the full list. The reality is, for those individuals who work in those roles, it's an important part of getting a thank you and a token gesture in many cases for customers. And across Watford, not only are many people working in hospitality receiving tips, but probably everyone across Watford, because we're a very, very generous constituency, will have given a tip over the past few years. So for me, I was quite shocked when I found out, especially during lockdown, when I was in the summer period where we could reopen restaurants and we were able to go back out and be able to give tips, that hospitality workers couldn't necessarily guarantee that they could keep them. And I think most people would be shocked that if you give a tip through the business, say via a credit card, which is increasingly more prominent and popular to do now, that you can't guarantee that the end person, the person you gave it to or the team that you gave it to, will receive that. And, of course, in most instances, businesses are totally fair and they're very kind and they make sure that those tips get to the staff who they've been given to. But sadly, as we may know across the board, there are always those who are unscrupulous and those who are unfair and will choose to exploit their staff and keep the tips for themselves, sometimes in part, sometimes in full. I'll take the intervention.
I'm really very grateful, and can I congratulate the honourable gentleman on bringing forward this bill. It's certainly one that I support, and it's hopefully a final victory for the long-running Fair Tips campaign run by Unite the Union. But as he says, we know that some employers can be extraordinarily devious and they can exploit loopholes in employment law at the expense of either the public purse or of workers. Can I ask what consideration he might be giving to future-proofing this law so that we can make it really difficult for operators, including those using digital platforms like Deliveroo, for example, to avoid the spirit of this very important bill?
Well, I thank the honourable member, but again, I'd like to say friend, for the question. I will be coming to this later, but it very much sits within the code of practice and making sure that at the heart of this bill, and the word you will see me repeat very many times, is the word fairness. And so absolutely that's baked into the approach that's going to be taken. And I'm looking forward to meeting, as I will say later, with businesses, sector representatives and unions to chat about how we make that code of practice really work well and make sure it's fair for everyone involved. Now, as you will have known over the past few months, actually, media reports have highlighted that this taking of tips, especially by credit cards, and then perhaps businesses taking more than their, not just fair share, but taking some of the share that they shouldn't even be getting, has been increasing, and the media has reported that. And so, for me, one of the reasons why that's a concern and the reason why this bill is so important, not just in principle, but right now and as soon as possible, is the fact that we are seeing this rise in the cost of living. And many people who work, especially in hospitality, they shouldn't need to rely on tips for their salary. And I'm absolutely clear within this bill that this is not about topping up salaries. This is about a gratuity, a tip or a service charge in addition. But they should be able to keep it. And it should be absolutely at the heart of what we do. And that's what this bill is going to do. And that's why I say fairness is absolutely key, because we all know a sense of fairness. We know what's right and wrong, and we know that if we give somebody some money as a thank you, they should be able to keep that money or choose to share it with others. And that's what's absolutely the key of this. And in the work that's been done over the past few weeks to really try and get this legislation right, I hope people will see that in the bill, and the Code of Practice will cover that.
Yes. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way and for bringing this really really important and I think overdue bill to the House. We're all thinking very much of the people in hospitality who will benefit from this, and I've been contacted by constituents who have had up to 15% of the tips removed from them in their pay packet. Now, obviously, this is going to address that. But also, importantly, this is something that will matter to members of the public too, because how many of us, when we go to pay our bill, ask directly, will the tips go directly to the person who has given us such great service tonight? And we don't know whether the answer that we get is going to be correct or not. This bill will ensure that we've got that security, that people who go and they pay their bill and trust that that tip will go to the person who's given them that service will actually get it. And I do hope, as every success with this bill, and that it will be backed up with a media campaign to let people know what is happening and to let people know that their tips will go to the person who actually deserves it.
My honourable friend makes such a brilliant point, and thank you so much for your endorsement, your support, and the work that you do with your constituency to make sure that that they're represented. And the stories you tell are the same as I've heard from so many members. In fact, a lot of members, I won't name them, but have come up to me and said, well, actually, when they were students, they worked in hospitality and they had this done to them. So this is something that really does cut through. And the point about the media campaign, I invite all colleagues from across the House to help me promote this as widely as possible. And I hope we get to the day in a few, hopefully in a year's time, hopefully sooner, perhaps a bit later, where you never have to, as a customer, ever say again, will you definitely be able to keep this tip? And that's one of the ambitions of this bill, and I'm hopeful that that will be the case. And when I speak to businesses as well, this isn't about bashing business, because most businesses are good people, good entrepreneurs, good CEOs, and most businesses do pass on those tips and they do it fairly. And for them, those that I've spoken to, especially again in my constituency and through fantastic members of Parliament across the House, they agree that business supports this as well, and hospitality absolutely does. So when I talk about fairness for workers, there's several key aspects to this bill that I will go through shortly. Oh, yes.
I congratulate the honourable member for bringing this excellent bill forward today. And I think fairness is the key word. And you've mentioned that you're working together with businesses and with trade unions. May I ask if you've reached out to the Cooperative Party, because I'm a Labour and Cooperative Party MP, and I'm sure that many businesses are cooperatives, and I'm sure that the Cooperative Party would be grateful if you would reach out to them. Thank you.
The honourable member makes a brilliant point, and the idea of the Code of Practice is to make sure that we do that engagement. And I'm hopeful that when we reach out to those sorts of organisations, they will also help with the media campaign, as has been highlighted just now. So this is about making sure everybody knows, and also highlight in the meantime that there are businesses that are not passing on those tips. So I hope people do challenge when they speak to businesses in the meantime. But there's several aspects that I will cover in this. First of all, in the bill, it's about greater transparency for employers and workers in teams of how tips should be treated, so that will be absolutely clear to everyone. The tip will create a level playing field for businesses who already pass on tips to workers in a fair and transparent way, which is in the most of them, but to make sure that they know that others will do the same as they have always been doing. And also to make sure consumers, as we've just spoken about, have the confidence that the full value of their tips will go to workers. And the premise of this bill is 100% that tip will go to the workers, and the Code of Practice will agree how that will be shared, and we can come to that later. So I'm going to set out the details of that, but I'll come to my member first. My friend first.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And can I just speak on behalf of all the backroom staff in our hospitality venues? My son worked for many years as a teenager as a pot washer for very little money, but always felt really appreciated when he got that little bit of top up on top. That was his share of the tips. So that we should remember all those people as well, and how important it is to them to know that they're valued.
Absolutely, thank you, and I thank you for your contribution. And may I also say that the staff here as well in this place, because they are fabulous, and I know on occasions some very kind members of Parliament do give tips, even though it might not be reported. So in terms of the fairness for workers, I've covered some of those points, but I want to go into a little bit more detail, if I may. So in terms of the bill itself, where employers receive tips directly from customers or have a control or significant influence over the distribution of tips which workers receive directly, this bill will create a legal obligation for employers to distribute these tips to workers in a fair and transparent manner. This obligation will attach the total amount of the qualifying tips paid at or otherwise attributable to a place of business of the employer, and the tips must be allocated fairly between workers at that place of business. So, for example, if you've got a big chain, it's not about it then going into a pot to everyone who works in that chain. It will be at that specific location, that particular venue. I think the other part for this as well, which is absolutely important, is to note that where employers do not receive or have control or significant influence over a tip, that will stay the same. So if I were to give a tenner at the end of a meal directly to a waiter or waitress for them, and it's clear it's for them, this bill will not need to cover that because that's directly to them. If they've put it through the business, perhaps through a credit card, then that would be where this bill comes into force. Similarly, if employees have already got like a tip jar or something and it's theirs and they look after it, that again won't be covered by this bill because it won't have been touched by the business, therefore they won't need to have that involvement. I think the other part to say that the key part here, again, is just, again, the fairness to make sure that businesses and employees know exactly where they stand. But it's also about making sure there's some flexibility there. Every different business is different. That's the very nature. If you're working in hairdressing, you're probably going to have a different approach to the way that you receive tips or manage tips than perhaps if you work in a restaurant or perhaps if you work in a bar in a hotel. What we're trying to do with the Code of Practice is make sure, the Code of Conduct is to make sure that that's covered, and that's going to come after this bill today, hopefully, if we can. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt my honourable friend mid-floor, but as someone who's had many an argument with the restaurant managers about removing service charges in London to be able to give cash directly to staff, and has nearly been thrown out of restaurants for it as well, can I just put on record my congratulations to him for bringing this bill today, but also my thanks on behalf of all the hospitality industry workers in my constituency of Workington and across the wider Cumbria area that will benefit from this.
I thank my honourable friend, and I know he stands up so strongly for workers and for the rights of people across this whole country, and especially for his constituency. So thank you for that intervention. I am very conscious that there is a thing called the Tronc system, which I won't go into too much detail now for time, but Tronc is a system, an arrangement really, commonly used in the hospitality sector, where an employer delegates the collection, allocation and distribution of tips to a person or persons known as a Tronc master or Tronc operator. The bill does not seek to regulate the operators of independent Tronc systems, which are commonly used by businesses already. However, I am aware, and when I've raised this previously when talking through how to make this bill the best it could be, I am aware that some stakeholders have been a bit concerned that could a business then put pressure on a Tronc master to do something that's unfair. And so the premise of this bill to mitigate the risk is that workers can bring an employment tribunal claim if an employer's use of an independent Tronc is not fair. So hopefully that will capture any concerns on that front. Another aspect of fairness is also, as we've just talked about briefly, is making sure there's no deductions from tips. And so the core of this bill is the creation of a legal obligation for employers to distribute all tips, gratuities and service charges to workers without any deductions. When customers pay service charges, they expect that money to go in full to the staff or to the individuals they've asked for. Sadly, some employers do retain part or whole of the service charge without passing it on to their workers. And so this bill will cover that. Some honourable members, though, have asked me whether this legislation will also cover credit card deductions and admin costs. And I know some businesses have raised this with me as well. But since 2018, payment processing fees cannot be passed on to consumers. So in line with this, employers will not be able to deduct payment processing fees from tips. This also includes a mandatory and discretionary service charges, which are automatically added on to customers' bills by some hospitality venues. And I'm sure the member from Workington has probably had arguments on that front in the past, so he can be relieved that that will no longer be the case. Administering tips should not, though, be significant in terms of the cost of businesses' operating costs. But for workers, that admin charge that might go towards a credit card admin fee could be significant for an individual. You know, £2 or £3 can be significant for an individual as a tip. So, again, I think it's fairness in here. It's making sure businesses don't have to incur huge costs, but actually that additional a cost that would come in from the tips actually is not significant for them, but it would be significant for the staff if they're taken out. So I think that's important to include that and to put that on record, and it's in the bill, of course. Ensuring that tips are passed on to workers in full with no deductions by employers will make a real difference to workers' lives, whilst not creating a burden on businesses. But an important practical aspect of the bill is, as I've noted earlier, the code of practice. And I'd like to expand upon that now, if I may, for a few moments. The bill includes provisions for the Secretary of State to issue a statutory code of practice, which will promote fairness and transparency in relation to the distribution of qualifying tips and help tribunals determine whether it is fair for an employer to make certain trunk arrangements. So employment tribunals must have regard to relevant provisions in the code when determining whether an allocation of tips or making of certain trunk affair arrangements is fair. The Code of Practice will consider some of the factors which will be relevant to that fairness, and it will provide a number of examples and real-life scenarios that exemplify fair tipping practices to help reflect the myriad of circumstances in which employers can handle tips in an acceptable fashion. The Code will be published in draft and consulted upon, as my honourable member mentioned earlier about the engagement. So it will be published in draft and consulted on before the relevant sections of this legislation come into force, and the Code will also require approval by each House of Parliament. So I hope that will reassure colleagues across the House that there will be scrutiny of that, but also that we'll make sure that that's being covered fully. The defining principles of the bill would not need to capture the nuances of that fairness as well. And as I mentioned, I want to engage widely on this to make sure that that code of practice really works. And I would say now to anyone who can reach out to me after this bill, if the government and the minister will please let's go through to the next stage and the House joins me in that, then I'm really keen to engage and make sure that happens. And I'm keen to hear those points. I think one of the core parts of this as well, though, is about remedies and enforcement. And crucially, the bill will be enforced by workers through the employment tribunal system and provides employment tribunals with remedies in situations where an employer has made deductions from tips or not allocated tips in a fair and transparent way. If an employer does not allocate tips fairly between workers, the employment tribunal can order the employer to do one of three things. Firstly, they could revise any allocation of tips they have previously made. Secondly, they could recommend that the employer deals with tips in a certain way. And thirdly, make a payment to a worker or a number of workers of the employer so that they receive the tips they should have received. The Employment Tribunal may additionally compensate workers for related financial loss attributable to a breach of these provisions by up to £5,000. And workers will also be able to make a complaint to an employment tribunal if their employer does not keep sufficient records relating to tipping practices, and the tribunal can order the employer to compensate workers up to £5,000. It is worth noting that workers must consult with ACAS before bringing forward a claim, and the majority of employment disputes are settled before they reach an employment tribunal. I would also like to be absolutely clear that this bill does not there's no rules within this that change things on taxation, so there's nothing in this bill that will cover changes in the way it is right now around taxation for employers or employees. This is purely about employers' rights and workers' rights. So I will conclude, because I want to hear honourable members' fantastic speeches that are no doubt coming up. I'm looking forward to hearing those speeches, and I would like to also thank the Minister and her predecessor, the member for Sutton and Cheam, for their incredible support on this bill to make sure that I can hopefully convince them today to get it over the line with colleagues. I would like to thank everyone who's helped me bring this bill to the House today as well, both members past and present, but also constituents and my fabulous Watford businesses and residents who have really raised repeatedly the importance of this. As we are all aware, the private members' bill process is fragile, so I'm keen to work together with all members, all organisations and everyone that I can to make sure that this works. So I urge the Minister to support this bill, and I will hand over to Mr Deputy Speaker to continue proceedings. Thank you.
There you go. The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and we've all learnt a new word today, tronk, which I will try in Wordle later. I should have said it during the last debate, so I'll say it now. I welcome the Minister to her new role. Jane Hunt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. I would like to thank the member for Watford for bringing this important legislation forward. The member for Watford is well known for his hard work, both for his constituents in Watford and also for supporting his colleagues. But now he's able to now transplant and transform the whole of the country, possibly, based on his work. Thank you very much indeed. I'm pleased to confirm that the government will be supporting this bill. Bringing these new rules into force will bring new protections to millions of workers and in industries where tipping is common, such as hospitality. This is especially crucial now as we continue to recover from the pandemic. During the pandemic, members were given quite detailed information about their own constituencies in order to help them during the pandemic. And I was surprised to find there are 3,000 people employed in the hospitality sector in Loughborough alone. That equates to exactly the same number as my biggest employer, so it really was quite a surprise and very interesting. It's good to hear the support in this House for these measures. I would like to take the time to address some of the points raised by honourable members today, but first I will speak a bit more about why the government is supporting this legislation. Many were appalled to hear the stories a few years ago of bosses wrongfully pocketing tips intended for their workers, money left by customers who wanted to recognise the hard work and excellent service they'd received of the staff. That is why my department took action to understand the scale of the problem. We launched a consultation to determine whether previous voluntary guidance in this area was sufficient. We have continued to develop policy positions based on evidence and conversations with stakeholders. The government believes tips should go to the workers who earn them, and that businesses who withhold tips from staff are wrongfully benefiting from money intended for hard-working staff. While many businesses already pass tips on to staff in full, our evidence shows some nefarious practice persists, with businesses deducting up to 10% in some cases. Some have raised with us concerns that they think bad practice has increased since the pandemic. This government is therefore pleased to support these changes through the bill. I will now reiterate some of the key details about what these new rules do and what they don't do. As my honourable friend mentioned, upon passage, these rules will prevent employers from making any deductions when distributing tips, apart from those required or permitted by existing legislation, such as under tax law. We are not making any changes to tax law under these new rules. How tips are treated for purposes of taxes and national insurance contributions depends on whether they are made in cash or by card, and whether they are made directly to the worker or processed by the business or by independent trunk. This will remain the case. Under this bill, anyone who is a worker will benefit from new rights. These rules do not cover those who are self-employed. These rules will apply across sectors, and this is the right across all sectors rather, and this is the right thing to do. But to be clear, businesses who do not normally deal with tips will not be significantly affected by this bill. This is a good opportunity to remind this House that tips already cannot be used to count towards national minimum wage pay. This has been the case since 2009. Yes, of course.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful for the Minister for re-emphasising that point. Can she confirm that it's still the Government's intention to pursue rigorously those employers who are still trying to make tips part of the national minimum wage, and that those companies should be named and shamed, as is currently the case?
I thank the honourable member for his question, and yes, that is absolutely the case, yes. I'll now talk about the proposed code. A voluntary code of practice on this topic was published in 2009. Our evidence shows that voluntary guidance alone is not enough to stamp out bad practice. This bill will therefore require employers to have regard to a statutory code of practice. The code will continue to be developed in partnership with key stakeholders and will be subject to a full consultation period before the final version is brought to the House for approval. The code will outline a fair and transparent allocation of tips, as set out in different example scenarios. It is very important that the code continues to be developed with stakeholder input, so we do not inadvertently disallow certain arrangements which are considered fair in some workplaces for the benefit of both businesses and workers. It is important that this code can be updated in the future with the approval of Parliament, but without any primary legislation in order to keep up with changing practices. I'll now address some of the specific points made by colleagues in the debate. And so we had contributions, first of all, from, of course, the member for Watford, and thank you very much indeed again for all that you've done. You raised a matter that I could almost have to declare an interest in, actually, because my husband interrogates the waiters whenever we go out to make sure that they are going to get the tip. It is surprising how many actually say the answer is no. Quite surprising. The member for Kensington clearly showed a good understanding of her businesses and her constituency. She talked about burgers, and I quite agree. It's the service that you pay for in the tip, not the burger itself, absolutely. Each establishment will create its own fare system, you referred to that as well, that is available to everyone working there, so they can include the kitchen staff and cleaners if they wish, absolutely, and they can decide what they want to do, and then that will be followed. And you also referred to consumers. It is also fair to them that they are within my brief too, and so I'd like to be fair to them. And I'd like to also commend her for what she did whilst working in Bays until recently. The member for Broxtowe talked about his experience and examples in restaurants in Broxtowe, and I can speak from experience, the restaurants are very good in Broxtowe indeed. And the member for Hartlepool talked about her great variety of restaurants on the Hartlepool Riviera in her area, and provided such great service to the people of Hartlepool, and again to be commended. The member for Charnwood talked about providing statutory protections and that is currently lacking in this system, and to reward the service given. He referred to being timely and fair, and the word fair comes through again and again in this bill, and he's absolutely spot on. The member for Meriden, thank you very much indeed for your kind words. I thoroughly enjoyed working with you on the APPG. And you talked about a shortage of, he talked about a shortage of workers due to the pandemic, and indeed previous to that. And I'm hoping that this will attract workers to the sector and help it to become a sector where it will form a career where you can get on in life. I'm very happy to meet him to discuss the hospitality sector as he requested. And the Shadow Minister referred to her surprise about some of the businesses, really quite well-known businesses, that have been taking tips. And absolutely, I agree. I'm quite surprised as well. Yes, though, we were always, as Conservatives, support hard work. And I think that's the vein we were talking about more than anything else. The members for East Ham, Watford, Cheadle and Meriden raised concerns about employers using tips to top up low-paid workers. The law is clear. Tips, gratuities and service charges cannot count towards the minimum wage. The bill does not alter this position, and under these proposals, employers cannot use tips to make up national minimum wage pay. And the member for Meriden was absolutely right that we need more workers to get the pay and tips they have earned to help promote employment in the sector, as I referred to before. And actually, there's no need to wait. No need to wait for this bill to come through this sector. Please do put in place your plans well in advance. The member for Watford referred to deductions from tips for card payments and admin fees. To be clear, under this policy, employers must pass on all tips to workers without any deductions other than those required or permitted by existing legislation. For example, normal tax rules will apply. They cannot make any deductions to cover costs of running a business. This includes the cost of processing card transactions or other administrative costs. And also, again, the member for Watford and Meriden referred to the code of practice and clarity around the code of practice. As I mentioned, the statutory code of practice will be published and consulted on before being laid before both Houses of Parliament for approval. The code will be developed through consultation in partnership with stakeholders. We hope to start informal discussions on the draft code later this year, and there will be more formal consultation on a draft after the bill has received royal assent. The code will provide details on when the bill applies, how many employers should distribute tips fairly, tronc arrangements, employers' tipping policies and record keeping. It will also include illustrative scenarios such as sharing out tips between front house and kitchen staff. In conclusion, bringing forward these new rules will protect over 2 million workers from bosses who do not currently do the right thing and give them an avenue to seek remedies. Businesses will be assured that they are not being undercut by companies where bosses are keeping tips for themselves, and consumers will have increased confidence that their tips are going to the workers they actually intended them for. And these new rules are backed by previous government evidence and analysis. The government is therefore pleased to support this private member's bill. Yes, of course.
The Minister for that, and I do congratulate the honourable member for Watford for bringing this forward, because it's very important. On a similar plea as one of my colleagues asked for in the previous bill, but will she discuss with the Leader of the House how we can get this legislation through quickly? Because I would certainly like to be on the committee stage if that's possible.
Yes, of course, I will ask about that. There are reasons, such as HMRC reasons and that kind of thing, why it might still be delayed. However, I will do exactly as the honourable member has requested. So, it's good to see the support in this House during today's debate. And if you take away, and takeaway being the operative word, given what we're talking about, if you take away just one word, it's about fairness. I look forward to continuing to work with my honourable friend, dear friend in fact, in charge of this bill, who works tirelessly for the people of Watford and also stakeholders to support the passage of these measures. Thank you.
And the last word, Dean Russell.
Thank you. Should I wait? Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With the leave of this House, I would like to thank all honourable members for their contributions today. Those from Kensington, interventions from Neath, Meriden, where I hadn't realised I was one of the great West Midlands exports, but that was wonderful to know. Broxtowe, Hartlepool, which I will hopefully endeavour to attend the Riviera as soon as I can. I did particularly like the speech by the member from Charnwood, because usually in his previous role, which he was always fantastic at, I would normally be lobbying him on my hospital. So it's so wonderful to hear him talking about hospitality instead. So a slight different phrasing. And, of course, Shadow Minister and Honourable Member from the SNP as well. I want to thank, really heartfelt thank you to the Minister at the end of her incredibly successful first week in this role for signalling government support for this bill. To be able to know that we're going to be changing, hopefully, the lives of so many millions of people across the UK is incredible, and I just want to say a huge thank you. I do hope that honourable members on all sides of the House can agree that this is an important piece of legislation to ensure fairness and transparency for workers and employers. And I also want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has campaigned on this for many years. I know that I am standing on the shoulders of giants, and those who have campaigned and fought for tips to be fairly given to workers for such a long time. So it's wonderful to know that. And it's a great opportunity to tackle, at this time, the urgency of getting this in to tackle the rising cost of living, to increase consumer confidence and help ensure hard-working individuals get the money they have been given, and they deserve. And I just look forward, when this bill is fully introduced, which I hope it will go through the House with full support, that I do hope that we can get to the day where we can end a meal or give a tip or say thank you and not say, will you get all of this? And that day, I think, hopefully will come in the next few months and years. So I will end by just saying the formal words of I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I congratulate the honourable gentleman on having achieved a second reading for his bill.